Hello again. We meet for the penultimate time. Meaning we have only one more meeting after this. The reading, I think, is straightforward. It's a very important part of the chapter that you guys understand really. The big pictures, we've talked now about people, now we're talking about borders. I always try to remind myself that it's just, as I put there in a quote, it's some guy with a map. It's some guy drawing a line. And typically it's a guy, no offense, women, but in our past, it's the men that typically have drawn the lines. That'll hopefully change as we go forward. And maybe somebody will get them right. But you're going to see going forward from about the 1800s, the lines being drawn really lead to a lot of the issues that we see today. And that's really what I wanted to cover with you guys. Again, it doesn't really follow the reading. The reading's more about just kind of understanding the conflicts that have come from the lines. Read the reading, watch the video. I think it's a very good video that you watch that I posted too. There's a lot of other things I would have loved to have shown you guys. Unfortunately, if you get a chance, if you have Netflix, check out it's called Bitter Chocolate. It's a series called Rotten. It'll make you think about things, sadly. And there's a lot of those videos out there that make you go, maybe I shouldn't have so much chocolate. Again, this is more about just kind of giving you guys a historical background because it's really important, especially going forward as I put in my notes for next year. I mean, this is really where I hang my hat. And hopefully you guys will look upon next year as easy because of what we covered this year, especially in this chapter. So again, go back to the evolution of the map. This is a 1914 map and how different it looks in Europe today compared to 1914. Again, the empires are gone. Again, take what you see over here. The Ottoman Empire now is Turkey, along with the Middle East being various countries here. We have Austro-Hungarian Empire, no more. This is now parts of the Yugoslav area or former Yugoslav area, Germany, so forth and so on. So anyways, this is the important part is that you guys understand the map is evolving as we speak. So the so-called modern nation-state concept comes from Europe. All right. And the idea behind this is that you had a king or a queen. They typically didn't speak your language, and that didn't sit well with people. It didn't resonate well with people. And I'll let you look through this. Again, this is hopefully historical in terms of its content. You guys might have heard of Montesquieu or Locke, but this is where the ideas come from that actually create the laws that we have here in the lands of the United States. Take the three types of power, legislative, executive, and judicial. Should sound familiar. This concept of nationalism, again, it begins in Europe. It's the idea that people should be loyal to their own people and not the king or the empire or whoever's got control. And again, this goes back to the people. Again, we talked about culture, the importance of language, religion, ethnicity, all kind of tying people in. There's typically intense feelings of loyalty and patriotism. Patriotism and nationalism, not quite the same. Patriotism is a part of nationalism. But for most historians, when we start talking about nationalism, we start to say that this gets to a point where we can boil over, where people are that empowered by what their beliefs are. Again, patriotism, 4th of July, those kinds of things coming up, very patriotic. But nationalism is a whole nother level. The tougher parts here that I can't really teach, unfortunately, so hopefully you'll get this, is the differences between imperialism and colonialism. Again, this all kind of goes along the ideas. So imperialism is the broader concept. It is a policy in which I control you guys. You could argue that my classroom is imperialist because I have an influence over you guys. Now, imperialism doesn't necessarily mean I have to have somebody there. I can walk away from my classroom and assume you guys are going to follow the rules. Colonialism, if I leave, now I bring in another teacher or another adult, and I make sure that they keep in line what we talk about. And again, go back to the 13 colonies here in the United States, what we saw in India. Colonialism means that you keep troops there. Doesn't work nowadays. It's very hard to continue to exploit land economically with foreign people. The people there aren't going to stand for it typically. And we saw that here in the Americas. We saw that in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. It no longer works. And that is why we don't have colonies today. But imperialism still implies that there's some sort of influence, and typically this is economic. All right, so we're talking money. All right. So, you know, the concept you really need to understand, I would say, is that you need to understand how nationalism allows for imperialism to continue. The sense of nationalism brings about this desire for glory and wealth of a nation. Take our current policies in the United States. Those are important that you understand that there's this pride and nationalism, uh, you know, based on where we're at and how competitive we are. A lot of times economics leads to this intense competition between others, and there is an intense competition, trust me, around the world for a lot of economics currently. And again, one of our biggest, I'd say, arch enemies at this point right now is Russia and China. Although we work very closely with China with our industry, those tend to be, again, your competitors. So you want to have that same market. And again, go back to the early 1800s, go back to the 1700s, all was the same. So you guys all know the suspects: England, Spain, on and on, Portugal, the Dutch, the French. Our map today, and the importance that you guys are going to get this is that our map today is based on what happened in our past. All right. Again, take the United States. All right. So there's two waves of colonialism. The first wave I just went over. And again, we're exploiting land. We're spreading religion, political power influences. Again, take the United States and what we see here, Christianity. You see the power being used for wealth and stuff like that. Catholicism in Mexico. Where did it come from? The Spanish, right? So, all this has an influence. And again, this goes back to understanding why things look the way they do. All right. At the end of the first wave, the strong nationalist feelings allows for this to continue. And again, you would sit there and say, well, how can people, enslave people? How can we allow this? Well, there's this pride of nationalism, and people unfortunately didn't look at, what was going on in the world. And you could argue today a lot of times, again, go watch Bitter Chocolate on Netflix. You're going to sit there and go, wow, I didn't realize that every piece of chocolate I'm eating, maybe employing someone, that doesn't want to be employed. So these things, you just have to understand, all lead to what we have today, the map that we see today. So again, the nationalism, is that pride in one country, and you're willing to do anything to make your country powerful. You're willing to go do maybe bad things just so that your country is in a better place, in a stronger place. After the first wave, takes us to the second wave. That takes us into the 1900s, or 1800s, I should say. And you'll notice the players there change on my screen. So now we have Britain, France, and the Dutch, but now Belgium and Italy and Germany all enter the picture. And this is a prelude to World War I, if you've not figured this out. They want to control the lands of Africa and Asia. As you can see here, they're dividing it up as a nice little cake. So it's now important to kind of go over superimposed boundaries. Those are boundaries drawn by people on the outside. So I can superimpose a boundary on your house right now. That would mean that I'm drawing a boundary you don't even know exists, but I'm going to draw it because I can. I have the power. Some guy with a pen, right? Some guy with a map. Most of the time, these superimposed boundaries are going to follow geometric lines, again, straight lines, and they typically do not follow any kind of cultural boundaries. They're usually just kind of drawn on a paper, and really no one really understands the dynamics that are there. Take the Treaty of Tordesillas. Again, this was a treaty drawn by the Pope to try to separate Spain and Portugal. Portugal took everything, as you can see, to our east here on this map. Spain would get everything to the west, and nobody knew that North America or South America existed. They just knew that there were some lands over here that Columbus and a few other guys that we had talked about before, including Amerigo Vespucci, had found, but they had no idea the reaches which Spain would actually claim here. So Spain would get the better of that deal, but again, typical geometric line, some guy, in this case a pope, deciding the line and drawing it as straight. All right, and again, fast forward now to the second part of colonialism, that second wave. The same thing happens. It's known as the Scramble for Africa. It's known as the Berlin Conference. You guys will read a lot more about that, I'm sure, hopefully next year. You're going to have to. But ultimately, these nations would sit down at the Berlin Conference and divide Africa, and guess who was not invited? If you guessed Africa, you were correct. So once again, European powers separating Africa with no consideration, no thought based on any type of cultural groups there. A lot of times you were either splitting cultural groups in half and putting them in different territories. You were putting enemies together, if you can imagine. And this all lays the groundwork for what we see today, all the civil wars, all the interstate conflicts. Africa still is dealing with the afterthoughts of what have happened with the Europeans basically coming in and carving this place up for economic gain. That was all they wanted. So the lines aren't drawn for the people. They're drawn for economic gain. And I'll let you kind of read through this. This goes back to Cameroon. You can see how it was divided here, and you're separating people. The issues that we saw in Rwanda with the Hutu and Tutsis. It's just the genocide, the horrible things that we see. All this pent up anger because of what happened 100 years ago. Short story is typically it's known as divide and conquer, where you put the smallest group in. You give them the power. The problem is when these colonial powers walked away, the small groups that were in power were now forced to basically defend themselves against the large groups that had been sitting there going, this is not going to last much longer. And unfortunately, a lot of bad things have happened in Africa, and I'll let you guys learn more about that next year. Again, to us, the importance is understanding the lines on the map, understanding how colonial movements, how imperialist movements all determined the lines on the map. And you can take modern day Africa. I think we've talked about this before, but the decolonization period after World War II. So, the devastation of World War II, every country took major heat. The only countries really to walk away unscathed were the United States. We didn't have any fighting on our soil, unless you want to count the Hawaiian raid by Japan. And Russia took major heat, but would come out of it in pretty good shape. Everyone else, even though England and France, technically won, they were destroyed and had to rebuild, which meant all the colonies, all the things that they had in place, to make money, was let go. So that is why I think I told you guys, when you talk about the beginnings of countries in Africa, if you guess 1960s, you'll see on this map, almost everything was born between 1960 and 1970. And that's every country in Africa, as you can see, or just about every country in Africa. The only one never to fall under colonial rule was Ethiopia. So that's you're welcome if you're ever on Jeopardy question. But the same things happen in the Middle East, which is going to lead to all the fighting that we see today. If you're not familiar with what's going on in the news today, the wars that we have fought, all those different things. So known as neocolonialism, just a separate word, just so you know, neo means new. We still see, this thought of imperialism, where the African countries are still being controlled, Latin America still being controlled. And I'll let you guys pause through this because I don't have time. I'm starting to run out of time here, it looks like. But, just wanted to touch base with you guys, and just kind of introduce you to, the ways of the world and the maps and how they've changed. And again, this all goes back to nationalism. This goes back to nation. What is a nation? It's a group of people that typically have culture, similar culture in histories in mind. So, it's one of those things where I want you guys to kind of realize. So here's where we would have written, or we would have watched Bitter Chocolate in class. But it's one of those things where I want you guys to realize, all this stuff that happens, take what's going on in India, northern India. As you can see here, I would have shown you something else, the former colonies, again, the buildings of Bangladesh and Pakistan, as you guys saw in the video, I think I showed in class. So, everything that's happened all goes back to some guy with a map, some guy with a pen, and whether it's us in the United States, whether it's other countries, they've all had this major effect on what is happening today, even though it happened hundreds of years ago. The lines on the map that you see. The wars that we have, the civil wars that we have currently today over any kind of resources like oil. Take what happened in Sudan. Remember, I think I talked about Sudan with you guys, maybe not, but Sudan is now a Sudan and a South Sudan. One of the newest countries introduced to the world in the last 5 years. So, and then we can go on to the civil wars. We can talk about, again, the genocide in Rwanda. You guys are going to have to, unfortunately, look this up. The decolonization period of India, again, Sudan, Myanmar, what's going on in there. I mean, this all goes back to ultimately some guy drawing a line. So hopefully that helps. I have one more video to post, and I'll do that next week. If you have any questions, drop me a line. If not, have a great weekend. Bye.